You weren't just a mother, not just a captain, and certainly not just another face in the crowd. That's what they would later whisper when the truth finally came out. But on that dimly lit morning, as she bent down to hug her son goodbye on the edge of the airfield, that truth was hidden beneath the simple image of a woman in her late 20s, uniform pressed, eyes tired but steady, lips pressed against a little boy's hair, as if trying to memorize the smell of home before stepping into the unknown. Make sure to like and subscribe if you agree no parent should ever have to choose between duty and family, because that's the choice she faced in the seconds before everything changed. The boy clutched her sleeve like it was the only thing anchoring him, whispering a plea so soft she barely caught it. "Don't go tonight, Mama." She smiled, not the bright smile of reassurance but the fragile, trembling kind only a soldier who knows what sacrifice costs can muster. The tarmac stretched around them in silence, a few soldiers milling about, their boots echoing off the hangar walls. But for Elena Ward, Captain Ward, the world had narrowed to one heartbeat, one embrace, one last moment of stillness before her comms cracked alive with a voice that cut through her spine. "Captain Ward, Knight Rider action confirmed." Immediate response. It was a phrase so rare, so heavy with consequence, that even the youngest officers who had only ever read it in doctrine would pale at hearing it out loud. And yet here it was, slicing through her final goodbye, pulling her from mother to soldier in less than a breath. Her son didn't understand, not fully, but he saw her face shift, saw the warmth fade into steel, saw her shoulders tighten like a storm had just stepped into her skin. He let go of her sleeve, not because he wanted to, but because he sensed something no child should ever have to feel, that the woman who tucked him in at night now belonged to a duty older and harsher than childhood itself. The order wasn't a drill. It wasn't practice. Knight Rider was whispered only when lives hung on seconds, when the kind of action needed was both immediate and irreversible. Her boots felt heavier as she straightened, forcing herself to look at him one more time, memorizing the curve of his cheek, the way his eyes shimmered with unshed tears, the small quiver of his chin he tried so hard to hide. For 6 years she had raised him with bedtime stories and birthday cakes, with laughter in the kitchen and whispered prayers in the dark, but for the next few hours, maybe longer, those memories would have to be enough. She kissed his forehead, lingering longer than she should have, then handed him gently to her mother, who stood nearby holding back her own storm. Elena didn't explain. She couldn't. There were no words to tell a 6-year-old that his goodbye had just become part of something written in shadows. She turned, squared her shoulders, and walked toward command, the weight of the comms still burning in her ears. Soldiers nearby noticed the sudden change, the stiffness in her step, the way her comm had sharpened into urgency, but none dared ask. Knight Rider was a ghost term in the military, a phrase reserved for situations no one wanted to imagine, much less execute. The airfield seemed to thrum with it, though most hadn't heard the words. She carried them alone for now, tucked behind a face of controlled silence. Every echo of her boots was a reminder that in a single breath, she had shifted roles. From mother to captain, from tenderness to steel. And yet, the echo of her son's whisper clung to her chest as tightly as his arms had only seconds before. "Don't go tonight, Mama." She was going. Not because she wanted to, not because it was fair, but because some calls don't wait, and some orders rewrite the very meaning of goodbye. And in that moment, as the doors to command slid open before her, Captain Elena Ward stepped into the shadows of a mission she would never be able to tell her son about, at least not for many years to come. Under the humming fluorescent lights of the operations room, the world shifted from the soft edges of a goodbye to the harsh clarity of war plans laid bare across glowing screens, and Captain Elena Ward, barely 28, walked in with her shoulders squared, the echo of her son's voice still trembling in the corners of her heart. Though her face betrayed nothing but the cool steel of command, the young lieutenants already in the room glanced up, some barely concealing the smirks that always seemed to follow her, whispers of too young, too soft, she's still just a mom, rippling like a careless undercurrent through the air. But Elena didn't so much as blink, didn't spare them a second of her attention, because the phrase she had just received through her comms, Knight Rider action, was not a line in a training manual to her. It was a reality, and it meant one thing only: civilians in danger, armed convoys moving fast, and precious little time before the unthinkable. She leaned over the console, eyes scanning the blurred satellite feeds, the columns of infrared signatures stretching across the dark roadways like veins carrying something toxic straight toward the heart of a sleeping town. The mission brief was thin, rushed, as if fate hadn't given them the courtesy of preparation. Multiple trucks, heavily armed, cutting through the night at speed, carrying what intel believed to be a mix of weapons and possibly hostages, their course threading dangerously close to a civilian evacuation corridor, meaning every second lost would place hundreds of innocents at risk. The officers in the room began to chatter, arguing over interception points, debating protocol, but Elena raised one hand and the noise fell away, not because her rank demanded it, but because her presence did, the kind of presence born not of volume but of certainty, the quiet command that comes when someone knows time is bleeding out and indecision is death. "We don't have the luxury of debate," she said evenly, her voice low, calm, but so sharp it cut through the air. "We have 7 minutes before that convoy crosses into the corridor. We block them here." She tapped a point on the map, a narrow stretch of road flanked by rising rock, a bottleneck. Immediately one lieutenant scoffed, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "Risky move, Captain. That's a mother's caution talking. You'll put us in the line of fire." The words landed heavy, mocking not just her decision but her identity, as though the dual weight she carried made her less, not more. A ripple of nervous chuckles followed. Elena didn't look at him, didn't rise to the bait. She simply locked her eyes on the screen, her mind already mapping the moves, the formations, the probabilities, the way her father had once taught her sitting at the kitchen table with salt shakers and forks standing in for tanks and convoys. She remembered his voice, patient but firm. "Sometimes they'll laugh, Lena. Sometimes they'll call you soft. Let them. Just remember, the ones who walk slow, who listen longer, who hold steady, they see farther." And so she saw farther. She ordered her team into position, splitting them into 2 groups, one to set up a false roadblock at the choke point, another to flank silently into shadows, ready to box the convoy in. As the units mobilized, her headset filled with the uneven breathing of soldiers trying to mask their nerves, the jitter of boots crunching against gravel, the metallic clatter of weapons settling into place. The lieutenant who had mocked her earlier muttered something about babysitting under his breath, forgetting his mic was still live, and a ripple of derision carried across the channel. Still, Elena said nothing. She didn't need to. The night itself seemed to hold its breath as the convoy's rumble grew louder, headlights cutting swaths of white into the black. The moment arrived like a lightning strike, trucks barreling down the narrow stretch, engines roaring, shadows leaping across rock walls. At her signal, the false roadblock lit up, a sudden flare of barriers and lights. The convoy hesitated, slowed, then swerved, and that's when her flanking unit moved, silent shadows closing in, weapons raised but not firing, every breath calculated. But then chaos erupted. One of the younger soldiers panicked, firing a round too early, sparks bursting against metal. The convoy surged forward in retaliation, gunfire shattering the night, tracer rounds slicing across the bottleneck. For a split second, everything teetered on the edge of disaster. Elena's voice cut through the storm, calm as stone. "Hold the line. Redirect fire, left quadrant, force them inward." Her orders were crisp, unshaken, and even as bullets tore the air, her strategy unfolded like clockwork. The trucks swerved exactly where she had predicted, boxed into the narrowest section of the pass, their auctions collapsing like a trapdoor beneath their wheels. Within minutes, though it felt like hours, the convoy was disabled, pinned, their weapons scattered useless across asphalt. And most importantly, the civilian corridor beyond lay untouched, silent, safe. The soldiers panted into their mics, disbelief mingling with relief. The mocking lieutenant, his earlier bravado shredded by the sudden realization that her gamble had worked, sat silent, his voice absent from the chatter. Back at command, the young officers who had smirked at her softness now watched in stunned silence as the feed showed dozens of lives saved not by bluster, not by volume, but by precision, by patience, by the steel of a woman who had walked into the fire with a mother's heart and a captain's resolve. When the dust settled and the convoy was secured, Elena didn't celebrate. She simply exhaled once, steady and controlled, then removed her headset. Around her, the room that had doubted her sat frozen, the weight of what had just happened pressing down like a stone. She had been mocked for hesitation, for caution, for being too much of a parent. But in the end, it was that same caution that had saved them all. And somewhere in the quiet beyond the battlefield, her son slept, unaware that his whispered plea, "Don't go tonight, Mama," had followed her into the night like a prayer, and that every choice she made had been, in some small way, for him. The sun had barely risen when the weight of the night began to settle across the base, not with noise, but with silence, the kind that lingers when everyone realizes they have witnessed something that can't be undone. Captain Elena Ward stood outside the command tent, her uniform heavy with dust, streaks of grime across her cheek, helmet tucked under her arm, and for the first time since the order had crackled through her comms, she allowed herself to breathe. Inside, the after-action debrief had ended in a hush. The same officers who had doubted her, who had whispered behind her back that she was too young, too untested, too much a mother to lead, now sat with stiff shoulders and lowered eyes, unable to disguise the truth that had unfolded before them. She had held the line when no one else could. She had carried them through the fire. And as the weight of that truth pressed down, the room froze at the sound of sharp, deliberate footsteps. Major General Langston stepped into the tent, her presence slicing through the stale air like a blade. Her uniform was immaculate, every ribbon perfectly placed, but it wasn't her medals that silenced the officers. It was the intensity of her gaze as it swept the room and landed on Elena. Without hesitation, the general raised her hand and saluted. It was not a perfunctory gesture. It was not protocol. It was recognition. For a heartbeat, no one moved, no one spoke, until Elena slowly, steadily, returned the salute, her hand trembling only from the exhaustion of the night, not from doubt. The meaning was undeniable. Respect had shifted. The weight of it had turned in her direction. Words spread in minutes, faster than smoke on the wind. Soldiers she had never spoken to began offering nods when she passed, some saluting before she even looked their way, a quiet chorus of acknowledgement that no one had ordered, but everyone seemed to know was right. The lieutenant who had mocked her earlier sat wordless, his bravado stripped away, his silence and admission more powerful than any apology. In the mess, whispers circulated about Knight Rider and the captain who had walked into a mission designed to break leaders and had emerged unbroken, carrying the weight of both command and love. But Elena didn't linger in the glow of their newfound respect. She didn't stop to drink in the change. Her steps carried her toward the temporary barracks where her son waited, each stride slower than the last, as if bracing herself for the only gaze that mattered. Her mother stood just outside, face drawn with worry, relief softening the edges when she saw her daughter alive, whole. And then, from behind her grandmother's legs, the boy emerged. His hair was tousled from restless sleep, his eyes wide and searching. He ran toward her and stopped short, staring up at the woman in dust-streaked fatigues, boots worn from battle. A captain who looked like both the mother he knew and a stranger the world now seemed to revere. For a heartbeat, they just stared at each other. Her, with tears pressing against her tired eyes, him with the kind of innocent awe that carried both relief and confusion. Then Elena knelt, dirt crunching beneath her knees, arms open. He launched into her embrace, clinging tighter than he ever had before, his small hands gripping her collar as if to anchor himself in a world that had nearly torn her away. His words were muffled, choked, but clear enough to break the silence. "You came back." She pressed her lips against his hair, closing her eyes against the sting of tears. "I promised I would," she whispered. And for him, that was enough. Around them, soldiers paused, some turning away respectfully, others lingering with something raw in their eyes. They knew they weren't witnessing just a reunion. They were witnessing the reason. The fire that had steadied her voice, the calm that had anchored her hand in the darkest hour, was not medals, not rank, but the quiet strength of a promise made to a child who believed her without question. She rose slowly, her son still in her arms, his head resting against her shoulder. The airfield had never felt more silent, more reverent. General Langston watched from a distance, her expression unreadable, But in the tilt of her chin and the softness of her gaze, there was something like pride. The soldiers who had doubted Elena now stood straighter, their eyes following her not with skepticism, but with something heavier, respect tempered with shame. They had laughed at her softness, mocked her caution, doubted her strength, but in the end, it had been that very softness that saved them, that very caution that outmaneuvered the convoy, that very strength that carried the night. The boy shifted slightly, pulling back to look at his mother's face. "What's Knight Rider?" he asked, his voice small but curious. Elena held his gaze, her lips trembling into the faintest smile. "A story I'll tell you one day," she said softly. "But not yet." And though he didn't understand, he nodded, resting his head against her shoulder once more, satisfied simply that she was there. The narrator's voice, if it could capture the weight of that moment, would not need to raise itself. It would simply say, they doubted her because she was young. They dismissed her because she was a mother. They mocked her because they thought softness was weakness. But legends don't always wear stars on their shoulders or shout their victories into microphones. Sometimes, they whisper a promise to a child, answer a call no one else dares, and return carrying a truth no one can ignore. And so, beneath the quiet light of dawn, under the code name Knight Rider, Captain Elena Ward did more than complete a mission. She carved a legacy into the hearts of everyone who watched her walk back across that airfield, her son in her arms, her head unbowed, her silence louder than any command. Not a myth, not a story, but a truth that would echo long after the night faded. Strength is not the absence of love. It is the presence of it, carried into the darkest hours and brought back into the light.